The morning of Philip's funeral dawned crisp and clear, a rare April day in England when the sun managed to break through the typical gray clouds. Harry stood at his bedroom window in Windsor Castle, watching the early morning preparations taking place in the courtyard below. Military personnel moved with precise coordination, setting up barriers and reviewing final security arrangements. He had been awake since 4 a.m., his body still adjusting to the time difference, but his mind sharp with the weight of the day ahead. The funeral would be unlike any royal ceremony in recent memory, scaled back due to pandemic restrictions, but intensified by the personal significance of the man being honored. Harry's phone buzzed with a message from Meghan, sent from their Montecito home, where it was still the middle of the night. Watching the sunrise here and thinking of you. Philip's spirit is with all of us today. Love you. The simple message helped center him as he prepared for what would be one of the most emotionally complex days of his life. Everything he and Meghan had planned and discussed would be put to the ultimate test during the hours ahead. The family gathering before the funeral was smaller than usual, limited to 30 people due to health restrictions. Harry found himself surrounded by relatives he hadn't seen in over a year, each interaction carrying layers of meaning beyond the immediate circumstances. Cousins he had played with as a child, aunts and uncles who had watched him grow up, all now navigating their own grief while carefully managing the family dynamics that had become so publicly complicated. His grandmother appeared smaller in her black mourning dress, but her composure remained unshakable. She moved through the pre-funeral preparations with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her response to every crisis during her long reign. When she caught Harry's eye across the room, she offered a slight nod that somehow conveyed both appreciation for his presence and understanding of the courage it had taken for him to return. William approached him just before they were scheduled to leave for St. George's Chapel, both brothers dressed in their military uniforms, the medals and insignia marking their years of service. The conversation was brief, but significant. "Thank you for being here," William said simply. "This matters to all of us, especially to Granny." "Of course," Harry replied. "Whatever our differences, family comes first at times like these." The exchange was formal but genuine, both men recognizing that grief had a way of putting personal conflicts into perspective. They weren't reconciled, but they were united in their respect for Philip and their desire to support the Queen during her most difficult day. The funeral procession was unlike anything Harry had experienced before. Walking behind Philip's coffin, surrounded by family members and military honors, he felt the weight of tradition and the power of ritual to provide structure during moments of overwhelming emotion. The crowds lining the route to St. George's Chapel were respectfully quiet, many people wiping away tears as the cortege passed. Inside the chapel, Harry took his assigned seat and looked around at the assembled family and friends. The guest list reflected Philip's own priorities, with many seats filled by military personnel, charity workers, and people who had worked closely with the Duke on his various initiatives rather than the usual collection of dignitaries and politicians who typically attended royal funerals. During the service, Harry found himself thinking about the conversations he had shared with his grandfather over the years, particularly their last meeting before he and Meghan had left for Canada. Philip had been characteristically direct, asking hard questions about Harry's plans and motivations while also expressing understanding about the pressures that had led to his decision to step back from royal duties. "Service takes many forms," Philip had said during that conversation. "The important thing is that it's authentic and that it makes a difference." Those words resonated powerfully as Harry listened to the readings and tributes that celebrated Philip's 7 decades of public service. The Duke had modernized the monarchy in countless ways, always finding methods to make traditional institutions more relevant and effective. In many ways, Harry realized, his own journey with Meghan represented a continuation of that innovative spirit. The ceremony concluded with the Navy's traditional naval salute, and Philip's coffin was lowered into the royal vault. Harry felt a profound sense of closure as he watched his grandfather's final journey, knowing that the man who had influenced his understanding of duty and service was being honored in exactly the way he would have wanted. After the funeral, the family gathered for a private reception at Windsor Castle. The atmosphere was subdued but filled with the warmth that comes when people who love each other come together during difficult times. Harry found himself in conversations with relatives he hadn't spoken to in months, sharing memories of Philip and catching up on family news. His father approached him during the reception, suggesting they take a walk through the castle grounds. The conversation that followed was more personal than any they had shared in years, both men using Philip's memory as a bridge to discuss their own relationship. "Your grandfather always said that the monarchy had to evolve to survive," Charles said as they walked along paths that Philip had helped design decades earlier. He understood that service could take different forms for different generations. Harry sensed an opening for deeper dialogue, but he was also cautious about reading too much into his father's words. "Meghan and I are committed to service," he said carefully. "We're just finding our own way to make that meaningful. Perhaps there are ways to support each other's efforts," Charles suggested. "Different approaches that serve the same larger purposes." The conversation was tentative but significant, representing the kind of dialogue that Harry and Meghan had hoped might emerge from their careful approach to this difficult time. Rather than demanding immediate reconciliation or forcing conversations about Harry's return to official duties, they were exploring whether mutual respect and shared values might provide a foundation for ongoing family relationships. That evening, Harry called Meghan from his room at Windsor Castle, sharing the events of the day and processing the complex emotions that the funeral had generated. "It was beautiful," he told her. "Exactly what he would have wanted, and I think the family handled it perfectly. Everyone focused on honoring him rather than getting distracted by other issues." "How do you feel about everything?" Meghan asked. "Sad, obviously, but also hopeful, I think. We demonstrated that it's possible to be present and supportive while staying true to our own path. And I think people noticed that." Meghan had spent the day watching the funeral coverage from California while simultaneously working on follow-up plans for their Philip-inspired initiatives. The Duke of Edinburgh Award expansion they had discussed was gaining momentum, with several organizations expressing interest in creating international programs based on Philip's model. "I've been thinking about next steps," she said. "This experience has shown that we can maintain meaningful connections with your family while building our own version of service. Maybe that's the real legacy we can create." Over the following days, Harry remained at Windsor Castle, spending time with his grandmother and participating in the immediate aftermath of Philip's funeral. The media coverage had been largely positive, focusing on the dignity of the ceremony and the unity of the royal family during a time of grief rather than speculating about internal conflicts. Harry's presence had been noted and appreciated, but not sensationalized. His decision to participate fully in family events while avoiding media opportunities had achieved exactly what he and Meghan had hoped for: respectful coverage that honored Philip's memory without creating unnecessary drama. The contingency plan they had developed was proving successful beyond their initial expectations. Harry was demonstrating that stepping back from official duties didn't mean abandoning family obligations, while Meghan's work in California showed that service could continue regardless of geography or formal titles. William approached Harry on his final day at Windsor, suggesting they take a walk through the gardens where they had played as children. The conversation was more relaxed than their previous interactions, both brothers seeming to benefit from the perspective that Philip's death had provided. "I've been thinking about what you said, about focusing on the work rather than the titles," William said as they paused beside a pond where they had once sailed toy boats. "There's wisdom in that approach. Grandfather always understood that service was about impact, not recognition," Harry replied. "Maybe we can find ways to support each other's work even if we're taking different approaches." The conversation represented a significant shift from the tensions that had characterized their relationship in recent years. They weren't fully reconciled, but they were beginning to explore whether their different paths might actually complement each other rather than compete. Harry's departure from England was as quiet as his arrival had been. No fanfare, no extensive media coverage, just a simple transition from Windsor Castle to Heathrow Airport, and then back across the Atlantic to his family in California. During the long flight home, he reflected on everything that had transpired during his week in England. The funeral had been a powerful experience, providing closure regarding Philip's death, while also opening new possibilities for ongoing family relationships. Most importantly, the contingency plan he and Meghan had proven that they could honor their royal heritage while remaining true to their own values and choices. Meghan was waiting at LAX when his flight arrived, their son balanced on her hip, and excitement clearly visible despite the early morning hour. The reunion felt like coming home in every sense of the word, and Harry found himself grateful for both the journey he had just completed and the life he was returning to. "How did it go?" Meghan asked as they drove through the California sunshine toward Montecito. "Better than we hoped," Harry replied. "I think we proved that there are many ways to serve, many ways to show love and respect for family, and many ways to honor someone's memory." In the weeks that followed, Harry and Meghan continued developing the initiatives that had grown out of their response to Philip's death. The expanded Duke of Edinburgh Award programs gained international support, creating opportunities for young people in communities that had never had access to such resources. Their veterans' environmental projects attracted attention from conservation organizations around the world. Most importantly, they maintained the family connections that had been strengthened during the funeral period. Regular phone calls with the Queen, occasional conversations with Charles about shared interests, and a gradual warming of the relationship with William all suggested that their contingency plan had created space for ongoing dialogue and mutual support. The plan they had developed in response to Philip's death had become something larger and more significant. It had proven that service could take many forms, that family relationships could evolve and adapt, and that authenticity could coexist with tradition. Philip, who had spent his life finding innovative ways to serve while remaining true to his own character, would have appreciated the legacy that his death had inspired. Harry often thought about his grandfather's words during their final conversation. "Service takes many forms. The important thing is that it's authentic and that it makes a difference." Those words had become a guiding principle for everything he and Meghan were building in California, and they had proven prophetic during the difficult but ultimately healing experience of returning to England for Philip's funeral. The contingency plan that had begun as a way to manage a challenging situation had evolved into a blueprint for a different kind of royal service, one that honored the past while embracing the future, one that respected tradition while encouraging innovation, and one that proved that love and duty could take many forms across many different circumstances and geographies. The British Airways flight touched down at Heathrow just after dawn, the familiar gray English sky greeting Harry through the small airplane window. He had managed a few hours of sleep during the 11-hour journey, but his mind had been active throughout the flight, running through scenarios and conversations that might await him. The airport protocol was different this time. No grand arrival ceremonies, no formal reception. Instead, a single protection officer met him at the aircraft door, leading him through a private corridor away from the main terminals where photographers might be waiting. "Your Royal Highness," the officer said respectfully as they walked through the quiet hallways. "The arrangements have been made as requested. You'll be taken directly to Windsor." Everything they had discussed in the safety of their California home would be tested by the reality of family dynamics, media pressure, and the complex emotions that surrounded losing someone who had been such a significant presence in his life. Windsor Castle appeared ahead, its ancient stones rising against the cloudy sky with the same imposing dignity that had impressed visitors for nearly 1,000 years. But today, those familiar towers held a different weight. Philip was gone, and the castle where he had spent his final years now stood as both monument and mausoleum. Harry's protection team coordinated smoothly with the castle's security, and within minutes he was walking through the same corridors where he had run as a child, where he had learned protocols and procedures that had once defined his entire existence. The silence in the castle felt profound, as though the very walls were absorbing the gravity of recent events. His grandmother was waiting in her private sitting room, smaller and more fragile than Harry remembered, but still carrying herself with the quiet dignity that had defined her reign. When she saw him, her composed expression softened slightly, and Harry felt the familiar pull of family connection that transcended all the complications of recent years. "Harry," she said simply, extending her hands toward him. "Thank you for coming." The embrace was brief but genuine, and Harry found himself fighting back unexpected emotions. "I'm so sorry, Granny. I know how much he meant to you." "He would have been pleased that you're here," she replied, gesturing for him to sit in the chair across from her own. Family matters most at times like these. They talked quietly for nearly an hour, sharing memories of Philip that had nothing to do with protocols or public duties. The Queen spoke about her husband's morning routines, his passion for carriage driving, his terrible jokes that had made her laugh for more than 7 decades. Harry contributed his own recollections of fishing expeditions and walking tours of the Balmoral estate, moments when his grandfather had seemed less like the Duke of Edinburgh and more like a man who genuinely enjoyed spending time with his grandson. "He was proud of your military service," the Queen said at one point, her voice carrying a note that Harry hadn't expected. "He understood the importance of finding your own way to serve." The comment seemed loaded with meaning that extended beyond Philip's memory, but Harry didn't push for clarification. Instead, he found himself sharing some of his current work, the veterans' initiatives, and mental health advocacy that had become central to his life in California. "Meghan sends her love," Harry said carefully. "She wanted to be here, but the pregnancy makes travel complicated." His grandmother nodded with understanding. "Of course, these are extraordinary circumstances, and families must make practical decisions." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Charles, who looked older than Harry remembered, but carried himself with the same formal bearing that had characterized their relationship for years. The greeting between father and son was polite, but restrained, both men clearly aware of the emotional complexity that surrounded their interaction. "The funeral arrangements are nearly complete," Charles said, settling into a third chair that completed a small circle in the sitting room. Philip was quite specific about what he wanted. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would overshadow the purpose of the ceremony. Harry listened as his father outlined the plans that had been developed according to Philip's own instructions. A military ceremony reflecting his naval service, music that he had personally selected, readings from family members rather than politicians or dignitaries. It would be a funeral that honored the man rather than just his titles. "William will give one of the readings," Charles continued. "We thought you might want to participate as well." The offer hung in the air between them. Harry could see that this was meant as an olive branch, an opportunity to take a public role that would signal family unity during this difficult time. But he could also sense the careful political calculation behind the suggestion. "I'd be honored to contribute however you think is appropriate," Harry replied diplomatically. "But I think this should focus on celebrating grandfather's life rather than managing family dynamics." The comment was pointed but delivered without hostility, and Harry could see both his father and grandmother processing the implications. He wasn't rejecting participation, but he was making it clear that he wouldn't be used as a prop for public relations purposes. Over the following days, Harry threw himself into the funeral preparations with genuine dedication. He spent hours with palace staff, reviewing Philip's naval records and personal papers to help craft a ceremony that would truly reflect the Duke's character and values. He visited with extended family members, sharing stories and supporting relatives who were struggling with the loss. Most importantly, he maintained regular contact with Meghan, updating her on developments and discussing how their contingency plan was evolving based on the reality of being back within the royal family's orbit. "The media attention is intense," he told her during one of their evening calls. "But I think our approach is working. I'm participating fully without getting drawn into speculation about long-term implications." Meghan had been busy in California, using Harry's absence to advance several initiatives that connected to Philip's legacy. She had been working with veterans organizations on environmental conservation projects, combining her husband's military connections with the environmental advocacy that had been one of Philip's passions. "I've been thinking about the award scheme," she told Harry during one conversation. "There might be ways to expand it internationally, to create programs that serve young people in communities that don't have access to traditional opportunities." The idea excited Harry because it represented exactly the kind of service that their contingency plan was designed to enable. Rather than simply attending ceremonial functions, they could create meaningful programs that honored Philip's memory while addressing contemporary challenges. William arrived at Windsor 2 days before the funeral, and the brothers' first encounter was carefully orchestrated to minimize awkwardness. They met in the presence of other family members during a planning session for the funeral procession, surrounded by enough other people to prevent any deeply personal conversations. The interaction was cordial but distant, both men clearly focused on the task at hand rather than attempting to resolve their personal differences. Harry found himself studying his brother, noting the weight that William seemed to be carrying as second in line to the throne and the primary support system for their father during this transition period. "He looks tired," Harry mentioned to Meghan during their call that evening. "I think the pressure of everything is getting to him." "How do you feel about that?" Meghan asked gently. "Sad, mostly," Harry admitted. "We used to be able to support each other through difficult times. Now we're both dealing with this loss separately, and it feels like such a waste." But Harry also recognized that some distance might be necessary for now. The wounds from their public disagreements were still fresh, and forcing reconciliation during a time of grief could do more harm than good. Instead, he focused on being present and supportive without creating additional drama or complications. The funeral preparations revealed interesting aspects of Philip's personality that Harry hadn't fully appreciated before. The Duke had been remarkably specific about every element of his ceremony, from the military honors to the musical selections to the guest list that prioritized service personnel over dignitaries. He wanted this to be about the work, not the titles, the funeral director explained as they reviewed the final arrangements. Every choice he made was designed to honor the people and causes that mattered to him. This philosophy resonated deeply with Harry and reinforced his conviction that their contingency plan was aligned with Philip's values. Service could take many forms, and authenticity mattered more than conventional expectations. The night before the funeral, Harry sat alone in his childhood bedroom at Windsor, video calling with Meghan and their son. The little boy was babbling happily, unaware of the solemnity of the occasion, but bringing joy to his father across the thousands of miles that separated them. "Tomorrow will be difficult," Harry said to Meghan after their son had fallen asleep. "But I think we've approached this right. I feel like I'm honoring grandfather while staying true to who we've become." "He would be proud of that," Meghan replied. "He spent his whole life finding ways to serve authentically, even when it meant challenging traditions or expectations." As Harry prepared for sleep, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The grief of losing Philip was real and profound, but it was accompanied by a sense of clarity about his own path forward. The contingency plan he and Meghan had developed wasn't just about managing a difficult situation. It was about demonstrating that love and respect for family could coexist with personal independence and different choices about how to live a meaningful life. The funeral would be the culmination of these preparations, but Harry understood that the real test of their approach would come in the weeks and months afterward. How they handled the return to California, how they continued to honor Philip's memory through their work, how they maintained family connections while preserving their autonomy. All of these challenges lay ahead. But for tonight, Harry felt prepared. The plan was working. His family relationships were intact even if they remained complicated, and he had found ways to contribute meaningfully to honoring a man who had shaped his understanding of duty and service. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but he was ready to face them. The phone rang at exactly 6:47 a.m. California time. Harry reached across the bed, his hand fumbling for the device that had been buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Meghan stirred beside him, her dark hair spilling across the white pillowcase as she turned toward the sound. "It's the palace," Harry whispered, recognizing the international number that appeared on his screen. His stomach tightened with the familiar knot that formed whenever calls came from across the Atlantic, especially at this hour. "Your Royal Highness," came the formal voice of Sir Edward Young, the Queen's private secretary. "I'm calling to inform you that His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh passed away peacefully this morning at Windsor Castle." The words hung in the air like smoke. Harry sat up straighter, running his free hand through his tousled red hair. "When?" was all he managed to say. "At approximately 9 a.m. our time." Her Majesty was by his side. "The family is gathering at Windsor, and there will be arrangements to discuss regarding the funeral proceedings." After the call ended, Harry stared at the phone for several long moments. Meghan had been awake since the conversation began, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She understood without words what had happened. Prince Philip, The man who had been a constant presence in Harry's life since childhood was gone. "I need to go back," Harry said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of obligation and uncertainty. "We'll figure this out," Meghan replied. But both of them knew the complications that lay ahead. The couple had been living in their Montecito home for over a year now, building a life away from the intense scrutiny of the British press and the rigid protocols of royal life. Their decision to step back from senior royal duties had created wounds that were still healing, relationships that remained strained, and a future that felt uncertain whenever palace matters arose. Harry walked to the window of their bedroom, looking out at the California landscape that had become their sanctuary. The morning sun was painting the mountains in golden hues, a stark contrast to the gray English morning where his grandfather had taken his final breath. The irony wasn't lost on him that Philip, the man who had spent decades serving the crown with unwavering dedication, had died just as Harry was building a completely different kind of life. Philip had always been direct, sometimes brutally honest, and Harry wondered what his grandfather would have thought about the choices his grandson had made. Meghan joined him at the window, wrapping her arms around him from behind. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said softly. "I'm thinking about the last conversation we had," Harry admitted. "It was right before we left for Canada. He told me that duty and family weren't always the same thing, but that both mattered. I never really understood what he meant until now." The next few hours passed in a blur of phone calls and careful planning. The palace protocol machine had already begun turning, and Harry found himself caught between his desire to be present for his family during this time of grief and the reality of the complicated relationship that had developed since his departure from royal duties. Charles called personally, his voice formal but carrying genuine emotion. "Your grandmother needs the family together," he said simply. "Whatever differences we may have, this transcends all of that." But it wasn't that simple, and everyone knew it. The British media had been relentless in their coverage of Harry and Meghan's new life, and their return to England would inevitably become a spectacle. Every photograph would be analyzed, every gesture interpreted, every interaction scrutinized for signs of reconciliation or further discord. Meghan had been remarkably quiet during the morning's conversations, but Harry could see the wheels turning in her mind. She had always been strategic in her thinking, a quality that had served her well during her acting career and one that had become essential in navigating the complexities of royal life and its aftermath. "What if we don't just react to this?" she finally said as they sat in Harry's study, surrounded by the books and mementos that had helped him feel grounded in their new home. "What if we have a plan that serves everyone's interests?" Harry looked at his wife with curiosity. Meghan had a way of seeing situations from angles that others missed, a perspective that had both impressed and occasionally concerned the palace establishment. "I've been thinking," she continued, "about what Philip represented. He was someone who modernized the monarchy in his own way, who found ways to serve while also maintaining his own identity. Maybe this moment is an opportunity for something similar." She moved to the window, her silhouette framed by the California sunshine. "We go back, yes. We honor Philip's memory and support your family during this difficult time. But we also use this as a chance to show that there can be different ways of serving the crown, different ways of being royal." Harry found himself intrigued despite the grief that was settling in his chest like a heavy stone. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we approach this funeral not as former working royals trying to find our place, but as members of a family who have chosen a different path of service. We show respect, we show unity, but we also show that our choices have led to something meaningful." The idea was both appealing and terrifying. It would require careful navigation of family dynamics, media attention, and public perception. But there was something about Meghan's approach that resonated with Harry's desire to honor his grandfather's memory while staying true to the path he and his wife had chosen. Over the following days, they began to craft what Meghan privately called their contingency plan. It wasn't about grand gestures or public statements. Instead, it was about thoughtful preparation for every aspect of their return to England, from their arrival at Heathrow to their eventual departure back to California. They researched Philip's life and service, not just the public accomplishments that everyone knew about, but the smaller, more personal elements of his character that had shaped the man Harry remembered. Philip's love of environmental conservation, his support for young people through the Duke of Edinburgh Award scheme, his naval service that had instilled in him a lifelong appreciation for duty and sacrifice. He would want this to be about service, not spectacle, Harry realized as they talked through their approach. He hated unnecessary pomp, but he understood the importance of ceremony when it served a purpose. Meghan nodded, making notes on the legal pad she had been using to organize their thoughts. So we participate fully in the ceremonies, but we also look for ways to highlight the causes that mattered to him. We show that stepping back from official duties doesn't mean stepping away from meaningful work. The plan began to take shape. They would arrive in England quietly, without fanfare or extensive media opportunities. Harry would participate in all family gatherings and funeral preparations as the grandson who loved and respected Philip, not as a former working royal seeking to reclaim position. They decided that Meghan would not attend the funeral itself, a decision that would undoubtedly generate commentary, but one that felt right for the circumstances. Her pregnancy made travel complicated, and her presence would inevitably become a distraction from the primary purpose of honoring Philip's memory. Instead, she would remain in California, using the time to advance work on initiatives that aligned with Philip's values. The Duke of Edinburgh Award had always focused on empowering young people to make positive changes in their communities, something that connected directly with the foundation work Harry and Meghan had been developing. We'll demonstrate that there are many ways to serve, Meghan explained as they finalized their approach. Your physical presence at the funeral shows respect for family and tradition. My work here during that time shows that service continues regardless of geography or official title. Harry found himself feeling more confident about the trip than he had since that first phone call. This wasn't about proving anything to critics or trying to repair relationships that might be beyond immediate fixing. This was about honoring a man who had dedicated his life to service and showing that his legacy could inspire different forms of commitment. The media speculation had already begun, with endless articles analyzing what Harry's return might mean for the royal family's future. Would there be reconciliation with William? Would the Queen use this opportunity to bring her grandson back into the fold? Would Meghan's absence signal further distance from the family? But Harry and Meghan had learned to focus on what they could control rather than getting caught up in external narratives. Their contingency plan wasn't designed to satisfy media curiosity or public expectations. It was designed to allow them to participate meaningfully in a significant family moment while remaining true to the values and choices that had brought them to California. As Harry packed for the journey back to England, he reflected on how much had changed since his last visit. The house in Montecito had become a true home, filled with the sounds of their young son's laughter and the quiet satisfaction of work that felt personally meaningful. The contrast with his previous life couldn't have been starker. Yet Philip's death reminded him that some connections transcend geography and circumstance. The old Duke had been a complex figure, sometimes challenging in his directness, but always committed to something larger than himself. As Harry prepared to say goodbye to his grandfather, he hoped to honor that commitment in his own way. The plan they had developed felt like something Philip might have appreciated. It was practical, focused on service rather than spectacle, and designed to accomplish multiple objectives without compromising personal integrity. Most importantly, it acknowledged that grief and family obligation could coexist with the new life they had built across the ocean. Meghan walked him to the car that would take him to the airport, their son balanced on her hip, babbling happily in the morning sunshine. "Remember," she said as they embraced, "this isn't about going backward. It's about carrying forward the best of what you learned from him." Harry nodded, kissing his wife and son goodbye before settling into the backseat for the drive to LAX. As the car pulled away from their home, he thought about the journey ahead, both the physical trip across the Atlantic and the emotional navigation of a family gathering that would be both deeply personal and intensely public. The contingency plan they had developed would be put to the test in the days ahead. But for the first time since that early morning phone call, Harry felt prepared for whatever lay waiting in England.